The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain as Staff Sergeant Maria Santos adjusted her radio equipment one final time. The mission briefing had been clear: infiltrate the enemy compound, gather intelligence on weapon stockpiles, and extract before dawn. What nobody had anticipated was the intelligence leak that would turn a routine reconnaissance mission into a nightmare. Maria's boots crunched softly on the gravel as she moved through the abandoned village. The silence was deceptive. Through her scope, she had watched enemy patrols pass through this area just hours before. Now, crouched behind a crumbling stone wall, she could hear the distant rumble of vehicles approaching from the east. The radio crackled softly in her ear. "Shadow 1, this is base. Status report. Base, Shadow 1. In position. No visual on target yet," Maria whispered, her breath forming small clouds in the cold mountain air. She had been deployed for 3 days now, moving carefully through enemy territory. The landscape was unforgiving. Jagged rocks, steep cliffs, and sparse vegetation provided little cover. Every step had to be calculated, every movement deliberate. The enemy controlled this region completely, and any mistake could be fatal. As she studied the compound through her binoculars, Maria noticed something that made her stomach tighten. The intel was wrong. The facility wasn't just a weapons depot. It was a major command center. Vehicles came and went regularly, and the number of guards was 3 times what they had expected. Base, Shadow 1. Intel was incomplete. This is a much larger operation than anticipated. Static filled her earpiece before the response came. Copy that, Shadow 1. Continue mission. Extraction in 18 hours. Maria knew something was wrong when she spotted the first patrol heading directly toward her position. They moved with purpose, not the random sweeping pattern of a routine patrol. Someone had given them her approximate location. She grabbed her gear and moved quickly toward a rocky outcropping 50 meters away. Behind her, she could hear voices growing louder. They were speaking in a local dialect, but she caught enough words to understand they were hunting for an American soldier. The first shot rang out just as Maria reached cover. The bullet sparked off the rock inches from her head, sending stone fragments into her face. She rolled behind a larger boulder and pulled her rifle around, scanning for targets. 3 soldiers were advancing up the slope toward her position. Maria took a deep breath, steadied her aim, and fired. The lead soldier dropped immediately. The other 2 dove for cover, shouting instructions to someone Maria couldn't see. More voices echoed from different directions. They had surrounded her position. Maria realized with growing dread that this wasn't a chance encounter. They had known exactly where to find her. She keyed her radio. Base, Shadow 1. I am compromised. Request immediate extraction. The response chilled her to the bone. Shadow 1. Negative on extraction. Maintain mission parameters. Base, I'm under fire. Position is blown. There are at least a dozen hostiles converging on my location. Shadow 1. Mission takes priority. Complete objectives and proceed to backup extraction point Alpha. Maria stared at the radio in disbelief. Backup extraction point Alpha was 30 kilometers away through enemy territory. With hostile forces actively hunting her, it might as well have been on the moon. Another burst of gunfire forced her to keep her head down. Bullets ricocheted off the rocks around her, creating a deadly symphony of metal and stone. She could hear the enemy soldiers coordinating their approach, trying to flank her position. Maria checked her ammunition. 2 full magazines, plus the one currently loaded. Enough for a firefight, but not enough to fight her way out of an entire enemy sector. She needed to move, and she needed to move now. She waited for a lull in the gunfire, then sprinted toward a depression in the ground 20 meters away. Halfway there, her world exploded in pain as a bullet caught her in the left shoulder, spinning her around and sending her crashing into the rocky dirt. The impact knocked the wind from her lungs, and for a moment, everything went gray around the edges. Through sheer willpower, she rolled into the depression just as another volley of shots peppered the ground where she had fallen. blood soaked through her uniform, and her left arm hung useless at her side. The pain was intense, but the bullet had passed through without hitting bone or major arteries. She was hurt, but she was alive. Maria applied a field dressing to both sides of the wound, gritting her teeth against the pain. The bleeding slowed, but didn't stop completely. She had maybe 6 hours before blood loss became a serious problem. The enemy soldiers were getting bolder now, thinking they had her pinned down. Maria could hear them moving closer, calling out to each other as they coordinated their final assault. She pulled a grenade from her belt, counted to 3, and hurled it toward the largest group of voices. The explosion sent dirt and debris flying, followed by screams and confused shouting. In the chaos that followed, Maria grabbed her gear and ran. She moved as fast as her wounded body would allow, staying low and using every bit of cover the terrain provided. Behind her, angry voices grew more distant, but she knew they would regroup and follow her trail. As the sun climbed higher, the temperature rose dramatically. The rocky landscape offered no shade, and Maria's water supply was limited. Combined with her wound, dehydration would become another enemy she had to fight. Hours passed in a blur of pain and desperate movement. Maria's shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat, and her uniform was stiff with dried blood. She had managed to stay ahead of her pursuers, but barely. Several times she had spotted search teams moving along parallel ridges, forcing her to change direction and lose precious time. As afternoon turned to evening, Maria finally allowed herself to stop and rest in a small cave hidden among the rocks. She checked her radio, hoping for friendly contact, but heard only enemy communications on multiple frequencies. They were coordinating a massive search operation, bringing in additional units and vehicles. Her own command frequency remained silent. Either her radio was damaged, or base had written her off as expendable. Neither possibility offered much comfort. Maria examined her wound by the dim light filtering into the cave. The bleeding had mostly stopped, but infection was already a concern. She had basic medical supplies, but nothing sufficient for treating a serious gunshot wound in the field. As darkness fell, she could see lights moving across the landscape below. Vehicle headlights and flashlights created a web of illumination as enemy forces continued their search. They knew she was wounded and on foot. It was only a matter of time before they found her trail again. She pulled out her map and studied it carefully. The backup extraction point was still 25 kilometers away, through terrain that was completely controlled by hostile forces. Even if she could travel at night and hide during the day, it would take at least 3 days to reach it. 3 days with a serious wound, limited medical supplies, and enemy forces actively hunting her. The odds were not in her favor. Maria keyed her radio one more time. Base, Shadow 1. Requesting immediate extraction. I am wounded and surrounded by hostile forces. Only static answered her call. She settled back against the cave wall and closed her eyes, trying to conserve energy for the long night ahead. Every instinct told her to keep moving, but her body needed rest to heal. The delicate balance between safety and necessity would determine whether she lived to see another sunrise. Outside the cave, the searchlights continued their methodical sweep of the mountainside. Enemy soldiers called to each other in the darkness, their voices carrying clearly in the thin air. They were getting organized, setting up a systematic grid search that would eventually lead them to her hiding place. Maria checked her watch. 3 hours until the moon set, providing her with the darkest possible conditions for movement. She would use that time to put as much distance as possible between herself and her pursuers. But first, she had to survive until then. The sound of boots on rock grew closer to her cave entrance. Maria gripped her rifle and held her breath, watching shadows move across the small opening. A flashlight beam swept past, paused, then moved on. Voices spoke in hushed tones just outside her hiding place. Maria couldn't understand the words, but The tone was clear. They had found something. Maybe her blood trail, maybe just signs of passage. Either way, they knew she was close. The flashlight beam returned, probing deeper into the cave opening. Maria pressed herself against the far wall, knowing that if they decided to investigate further, she would have to fight her way out. The beam lingered for what felt like an eternity before finally moving away. The voices faded as the patrol continued their search in another direction. Maria allowed herself to breathe again, but she knew her hiding place had been compromised. She couldn't stay here much longer. As the hours passed, the activity outside gradually diminished. The enemy was regrouping, probably setting up a perimeter to contain her in this area until daylight made a thorough search possible. They thought they had her trapped. Maria smiled grimly in the darkness. She had been in worse situations before, though admittedly not many. The key to survival was staying calm, thinking clearly, and never giving up hope. Someone would come for her eventually. She just had to stay alive long enough for that to happen. The radio crackled softly in her ear. For a moment, her heart jumped, thinking it might be friendly forces. But the voice that came through spoke in the enemy's language, coordinating the search effort. They were using her frequency, try to triangulate her position if she transmitted. Maria turned off her radio to conserve battery power. When she turned it back on, it would only be to call for help or to coordinate with friendly forces. Until then, she was completely on her own. She gathered her gear and prepared to move. The moon had set, and the darkness was complete. It was time to begin the longest journey of her life. 25 kilometers through enemy territory, wounded and alone, with no guarantee that anyone would be waiting for her at the end. As Maria crept out of the cave and into the hostile night, she carried with her the training, determination, and courage that had brought her this far. She also carried something else, the absolute certainty that she would not give up, no matter what lay ahead. The first step was always the hardest. After that, it was just a matter of putting one foot in front of the other until she reached safety. Or died. Trying the darkness was both Maria's greatest ally and most dangerous enemy. While it concealed her movement from searching eyes, it also made every step treacherous on the rocky mountain terrain. Her wounded shoulder sent jolts of pain through her body with each movement, but she forced herself to maintain a steady pace. 3 hours into her night journey, Maria had covered only 2 kilometers. The combination of her injury, the difficult terrain, and the need for absolute stealth made progress agonizingly slow. Several times she had been forced to backtrack when the sound of vehicle engines or radio chatter indicated enemy patrols ahead. She paused behind a cluster of boulders to check her map and compass. The extraction point lay to the northwest, but the most direct route would take her through a valley that was almost certainly being watched. She would have to take the longer mountain route, adding at least 10 kilometers to an already impossible journey. The first hint of dawn was beginning to show on the eastern horizon when Maria finally found a place to rest. A narrow crevice between 2 large rocks provided concealment from above while still allowing her to monitor the approaches. She squeezed inside and immediately applied fresh bandages to her shoulder wound. The injury was worse than she had initially thought. Despite her field dressing, it had continued to seep blood throughout the night. More concerning was the growing stiffness in her arm and the dull ache that suggested inflammation. Without proper medical treatment, infection was inevitable. As daylight strengthened, Maria could see the full extent of the search operation below. Vehicles moved along every road and track, while helicopters began their morning reconnaissance flights. The enemy had committed significant resources to finding her, which meant they considered her either very dangerous or very valuable. Through her binoculars, she watched a patrol of 6 soldiers moving along a ridge less than a kilometer away. They moved with professional discipline, checking every potential hiding place methodically. These weren't militia fighters or local recruits. They were experienced soldiers who knew their business. Maria settled in for a long day of hiding. Moving during daylight would be suicide with this level of enemy activity. She would have to wait for darkness and hope that her wound didn't deteriorate too much in the meantime. The temperature climbed steadily as the sun rose higher. The rocks around her began to radiate heat, turning her hiding place into an oven. Maria rationed her water carefully, taking small sips every hour. Dehydration would kill her just as surely as an enemy bullet. Around midday, she was startled by the sound of voices very close to her position. A patrol had stopped less than 50 meters away, apparently taking a break in whatever shade they could find. Maria could hear them clearly as they discussed the search operation. From their conversation, she learned that the enemy believed she was carrying important intelligence about upcoming military operations. They had orders to take her alive if possible, but dead if necessary. The priority was preventing her from reaching friendly forces with whatever information she possessed. Maria almost laughed despite her situation. The irony was that her actual intelligence gathering had been minimal before the mission went wrong. But the enemy's assumption that she carried vital secrets had inadvertently escalated her importance and the resources dedicated to stopping her. The patrol remained in the area for over an hour before moving on. During that time, Maria barely dared to breathe. Discovery would mean immediate capture or death, and she wasn't ready for either option. As afternoon wore on, the heat became almost unbearable. Maria's water supply was running dangerously low, and she hadn't eaten anything substantial in over 24 hours. Her body was running on reserves that wouldn't last much longer. The wound in her shoulder had definitely become infected. Red streaks were beginning to appear on her skin, and the area around the bullet hole was hot and swollen. She had antibiotics in her medical kit, but only enough for a few days. After that, she would be fighting sepsis as well as enemy forces. Evening brought some relief from the heat, but also renewed enemy activity. Fresh patrols took up positions around the search area, and Maria could see vehicle headlights beginning to probe the darkness. They were preparing for another night of intensive hunting. Maria waited until full darkness before emerging from her hiding place. Her muscles were stiff from hours of immobility, and her shoulders screamed in protest as she shouldered her pack. But she had to move. Staying in one place too long was certain death. The second night of movement was even more difficult than the first. Maria's condition had deteriorated significantly, and she found herself making mistakes that could have been fatal. Twice she nearly walked into enemy positions because fatigue and fever were affecting her judgment. By dawn of the second day, she had managed to travel only 4 more kilometers. At this rate, it would take over a week to reach the extraction point, assuming she could survive that long. Her water was nearly gone, and the infection in her shoulder was spreading rapidly. Maria found shelter in an abandoned shepherd's hut on a remote hillside. The structure was partially collapsed, but it provided better protection than the rocky crevices she had been using. More importantly, there was a small well nearby that might provide water. She approached the well carefully, watching for any signs of enemy activity. The area appeared deserted, but she knew that could change quickly. Using her rifle sling as a rope, she lowered her water bottles into the well and was relieved to hear them splash. The water was brackish and tasted of minerals, but it was wet. Maria filled both bottles and added purification tablets, then drank deeply for the first time in 2 days. The relief was immediate and overwhelming. Inside the abandoned hut, Maria finally allowed herself to examine her wound properly. The infection was severe, and she was beginning to develop a fever. She cleaned the wound as best she could with her limited supplies and injected herself with antibiotics, but she knew it was probably too little, too late. As she lay on the dirt floor of the ruined hut, Maria tried to contact friendly forces one more time. She powered up her radio and tuned to the emergency frequency, hoping against hope that someone would answer. Any station, this is Shadow 1. Emergency extraction required. Grid reference. She recited her position and waited for a response. Static filled her earpiece, punctuated by occasional bursts of enemy radio traffic. No friendly voices answered her call. Either she was out of range, or there was no one listening. Maria turned off the radio to save battery power and settled back against the crumbling wall. Outside, she could hear the distant sound of helicopters beginning their daily search pattern. Soon, ground patrols would follow, systematically checking every structure and hiding place in the area. She knew she couldn't stay in the hut much longer. The abandoned buildings would be among the first places they searched thoroughly. But in her current condition, moving during daylight was almost impossible, and traveling at night was becoming increasingly difficult. As the sun climbed higher, Maria made a decision that went against all her training. She was going to have to take a huge risk and move during daylight hours. Her condition was deteriorating too rapidly to wait for nightfall, and the enemy's search pattern was tightening around her. She studied her map carefully, plotting a route that would use whatever cover was available while moving toward a distant ridgeline. If she could reach the high ground, she might be able to establish radio contact with friendly forces, or at least get a better view of potential escape routes. The journey across open ground in broad daylight was terrifying. Every shadow could hide an enemy soldier. Every sound could signal approaching danger. Maria moved in short rushes from one piece of cover to the next, constantly watching and listening for signs of detection. Halfway to the ridge, disaster struck. A helicopter appeared without warning over the crest of a hill, flying low and fast directly toward her position. Maria dove behind a large rock just as the aircraft passed overhead, its downdraft kicking up dust and debris around her hiding place. The helicopter circled back for another pass, this time flying slower and lower. Maria pressed herself against the ground, hoping her camouflaged uniform would blend with the rocks and earth. The aircraft hovered directly above her for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes before moving on to search another area. When the helicopter was gone, Maria remained motionless for another 10 minutes, listening for any indication that she had been spotted. Finally, satisfied that she had avoided detection, she resumed her desperate journey toward the ridge. The climb was exhausting. Maria's fever was getting worse, and she was beginning to experience periods of disorientation. Several times she found herself standing in the open with no memory of how she had gotten there, her mind wandering as her body continued to move on autopilot. Near the top of the ridge, she discovered something that filled her with both hope and dread. Fresh tire tracks led to a recently abandoned observation post. The enemy had been using this location to coordinate their search efforts, which meant they had excellent visibility over the entire area. But it also meant that Maria now had access to that same vantage point. From the ridge top, she could see for dozens of kilometers in every direction. More importantly, she could see the pattern of enemy movements and identify potential gaps in their search perimeter. Maria studied the landscape through her binoculars, noting the positions of patrols and checkpoints. The enemy had established a rough circle around the area where they believed she was hiding, but the circle was large and they didn't have enough troops to cover every possible escape route completely. She identified a narrow canyon system that appeared to be only lightly patrolled. If she could reach it without being detected, the rocky terrain would provide excellent concealment for movement. But getting there would require crossing nearly 3 kilometers of open ground with minimal cover. As evening approached, Maria prepared to attempt the most dangerous part of her journey yet. She checked her equipment one final time, applied fresh bandages to her infected wound, and tried to force down some food despite her fever and nausea. The sun was setting behind the mountains when she began her descent from the ridge. In a few hours, she would either be safely hidden in the canyon system or dead. There was no middle ground left in her situation. Maria moved carefully down the hillside, using every shadow and depression for concealment. Behind her, the lights of enemy vehicles began to appear as the search operation shifted to its night configuration. Ahead lay the most challenging terrain she had yet encountered, and beyond that, the slim hope of eventual rescue. Every step took her further from safety and deeper into territory controlled by forces that wanted her dead. But every step also brought her closer to the extraction point and the possibility of survival. The mathematics of desperation had become very simple. Keep moving forward or die where she stood. As darkness enveloped the mountains, Maria Santos continued her lonely journey through enemy territory, wounded and alone but still fighting. The night held both promise and peril, and she would face whatever came with the same determination that had brought her this far. The canyon was still 2 kilometers away when she heard the sound that changed everything. The distant static of a radio transmission on a frequency she hadn't heard before. It wasn't the enemy communications she had been monitoring. This was something different, something that might offer a glimmer of hope in her desperate situation. Maria froze in place, straining to hear the radio transmission that had caught her attention. The signal was faint and intermittent, coming from somewhere ahead in the canyon system she had been trying to reach. She adjusted her radio carefully, trying to isolate the frequency without broadcasting her own position. The voice that emerged from the static was speaking English with an American accent. Maria's heart jumped as she recognized military radio protocol, but the transmission was too broken to understand completely. Someone else was operating in this area, possibly friendly forces. She crept forward more cautiously now, knowing that the radio signals could belong to either rescuers or enemies using capture equipment. In her current condition, making the wrong assumption could be fatal. The infection in her shoulder was making her dizzy, and she had to stop frequently to rest and regain her focus. The terrain became more challenging as she approached the canyon. Loose rocks shifted under her feet, threatening to start small avalanches that would alert anyone in the area to her presence. Maria moved from handhold to handhold, testing each grip carefully before trusting her way to it. 2 hours after hearing the first transmission, she picked up the signal again. This time it was clearer, and she could make out portions of what was being said. The voice mentioned grid coordinates that were very close to her current position, and used call signs that sounded genuinely American. Maria made a decision that went against every survival instinct she possessed. She was going to attempt contact with whoever was broadcasting those signals. If they were friendly forces, they might be her only hope of survival. If they were enemies, she was probably dead anyway. She climbed to a rocky outcropping that would give her radio better range and powered up her communications equipment. Taking a deep breath, she keyed the microphone and spoke quietly into the darkness. Unknown station transmitting on frequency 142.25. This is Shadow 1. Request authentication. Over. The response came within seconds, and Maria's knees nearly buckled with relief when she heard the proper authentication code. Whoever was out, their new current American military procedures. Shadow 1, this is Recon 6. Authenticate Bravo 7-4. We've been looking for you. Over. Maria's hands shook as she consulted her authentication card and provided the correct response. For the first time in 3 days, she wasn't completely alone in enemy territory. Recon 6, Shadow 1. I am wounded and require immediate extraction. Current position. She provided her coordinates and waited for a response. Shadow 1. We copy your position. We are approximately 2 kilometers northeast of your location. Can you move to us, or do you need us to come to you? Over. Maria considered her options carefully. Moving to their position would be safer for both parties, but she wasn't sure she had the strength for another 2-kilometer journey. On the other hand, asking them to come to her would put the rescue team at risk. Recon 6, I am mobile, but wounded. Infection setting in. I can attempt to reach your position, but movement will be slow. Over. Copy that, Shadow 1. We're going to move toward you. Look for IR strobes flashing in sequence 323. We'll be monitoring this frequency. Move when you can, hide when you can't. We'll find you. Over. The knowledge that friendly forces were actively searching for her gave Maria strength she didn't know she still possessed. She gathered her gear and began moving northeast through the canyon, following a dry stream bed that provided some concealment from observation. The terrain in the canyon was treacherous even in daylight, and navigating it by starlight was extremely dangerous. Loose rocks and sudden drop-offs created constant hazards, while the narrow walls channeled sound in ways that made it impossible to determine the direction of approaching threats. Maria had traveled less than a kilometer when she heard enemy voices echoing through the canyon behind her. A patrol had apparently decided to search this area, and they were moving systematically through the same route she had taken. She increased her pace despite the growing pain in her shoulder and the fever that was making her increasingly unsteady. The sound of boots on stone grew closer, forcing Maria to find hiding places among the boulders that littered the canyon floor. She pressed herself into a narrow crevice, just as flashlight beams began probing the darkness around her position. The enemy patrol consisted of 4 soldiers moving in tactical formation. They had night vision equipment and sophisticated communications gear, indicating this was an elite unit rather than regular infantry. Maria watched them through gaps in the rocks, noting their professional movements and careful coordination. One of the soldiers stopped less than 10 meters from Maria's hiding place and began examining the ground carefully. Even in the darkness, he had apparently spotted some sign of her passage. Maria held her breath and gripped her rifle, knowing that discovery would mean a firefight she probably couldn't win in her current condition. The soldier called out to his companions and pointed toward the rocks where Maria was hidden. They began moving in her direction, spreading out to cover multiple approach angles. In seconds, they would be close enough to spot her even in the darkness. A sound from further up the canyon made the patrol freeze and redirect their attention. Someone else was moving through the area, apparently unaware of the enemy presence. The patrol leader made quick hand signals, and his team moved toward the new contact. Maria realized with growing horror that the sounds were probably coming from the American reconnaissance team that was trying to reach her. They were walking into an ambush, and she was the only person who could warn them. She keyed her radio and whispered urgently into the microphone. Recon 6, Shadow 1. Enemy patrol moving toward your position. 4 hostiles with night vision, approximately 100 meters south of your location. Over. The response came immediately. Shadow 1, copy enemy contact. We have them on thermal imaging. Moving to avoid contact. Continue toward our position. Over. The night erupted in gunfire as the 2 forces spotted each other simultaneously. Muzzle flashes lit up the canyon walls, and the sound of automatic weapons fire echoed like thunder between the narrow stone walls. Maria could hear orders being shouted in both English and the enemy language as the firefight intensified. She had to make another impossible decision: stay hidden and hope the American team could extract themselves from the ambush, or join the fight despite her wounded condition and limited ammunition. If the rescue team was wiped out, her chances of survival dropped to virtually zero. Maria made her choice and began moving toward the battle. She used the noise and muzzle flashes to mask her approach, getting as close as possible before choosing her targets. The enemy soldiers were focused on the main firefight and hadn't noticed her flanking movement. Her first shot dropped one of the enemy soldiers immediately. The second shot missed as her target dove for cover, but it drew attention away from the American position long enough for them to maneuver to better cover. Maria shifted positions and continued engaging targets of opportunity. The firefight lasted only a few minutes, but it felt like hours. When the shooting finally stopped, 3 enemy soldiers were dead, and one had apparently escaped to report the contact. Maria called out her identity before approaching the American position, not wanting to be shot by the people trying to rescue her. Shadow 1, is that you? Hell of a time for you to show up, came the response from behind a cluster of boulders. Maria approached carefully and was surprised to find only 2 soldiers instead of the larger team she had expected. Both were wearing full combat gear with advanced night vision and communications equipment. Despite being outnumbered, they had handled themselves professionally in the firefight. "Ma'am, I'm Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, and this is Specialist Chun. We're part of a reconnaissance team that's been looking for you for the past 2 days," the senior soldier explained as he helped Maria to cover. "How did you know where to find me?" Maria asked, finally allowing herself to feel some relief at not being alone anymore. "Your last radio transmission 2 days ago gave us a general area. We've been monitoring enemy communications and tracking their search patterns to narrow down your possible location. When you made contact tonight, we were already in the area." Specialist Chun was examining Maria's shoulder wound by the light of a red-filtered flashlight. "Sergeant, this is infected pretty badly. She needs real medical treatment soon, or this could become life-threatening." Rodriguez nodded grimly. "Our extraction point is 8 kilometers from here. The question is whether you can make it that far, or if we need to call for immediate evacuation." "I can make it," Maria said, though she wasn't entirely certain that was true. "What's the situation with enemy forces?" "They've got this whole area locked down tight. We've identified at least 3 companies involved in the search operation, plus air support during daylight hours. The extraction point is the only area we're confident is clear, but getting there won't be easy." The sound of vehicle engines in the distance reminded them that the firefight would bring reinforcements quickly. Rodriguez made a quick decision. "We need to move now. That patrol will be missed, and they'll flood this area with troops within the hour." The 3 soldiers began moving through the canyon, with Chun taking point and Rodriguez helping Maria when the terrain became too difficult for her to manage alone. The pace was faster than anything Maria had maintained since being wounded, but the knowledge that professional soldiers were depending on her gave her additional motivation. They traveled through the night, stopping only when necessary to avoid enemy patrols or when Maria's condition required a brief rest. Rodriguez had given her stronger antibiotics from his medical kit, and the fever was beginning to subside slightly. As dawn approached, they found shelter in a cave system that Rodriguez and Chun had apparently scouted earlier. The hiding place was well concealed and had multiple escape routes if they were discovered. More importantly, it had fresh water from an underground spring. 8 hours until the extraction window opens, Rodriguez explained as they settled into the cave. "The helicopter will be on station for exactly 10 minutes. If we're not there, they won't wait." Maria understood the implications. This was her one chance to get out of enemy territory alive. If anything went wrong during the final approach to the extraction point, there wouldn't be another opportunity. Chun had been monitoring enemy radio communications throughout their movement. "They know we're in this area now. I'm picking up traffic about the firefight, and they're bringing in additional units. They're also talking about establishing a tighter perimeter around the extraction zone." "Do they know where we're going?" Maria asked. "Probably not the exact location, but they're not stupid. There are only so many places a helicopter can land safely in this terrain. They'll have those areas watched." Rodriguez studied his map carefully. "We have 2 options. Take the direct route and risk running into a prepared ambush, or take the long way around and risk missing the extraction window." Maria looked at the map and considered their options. Both routes carried significant risks, but the decision would ultimately determine whether she lived or died. After 3 days of running and hiding, everything would come down to the next 8 hours. "What's your recommendation, Sergeant?" she asked. Rodriguez met her eyes steadily. "Ma'am, we didn't come this far to leave you behind. Whatever route gives us the best chance of getting you to that helicopter, that's the one we take." As the 3 soldiers prepared for what might be their final mission together, Maria reflected on the remarkable fact that 2 men she had never met were willing to risk their lives to save hers. The brotherhood of the military had reached across enemy territory to pull her back from the edge of death. Outside their cave, enemy forces continued their search with renewed intensity. But inside, 3 American soldiers planned their escape with the quiet confidence of professionals who had faced impossible odds before and survived. The extraction point was still hours away, But for the first time since this nightmare began, Maria Santos believed she might actually live to see another sunset. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the rocky landscape as the three soldiers prepared to make their final push toward the extraction point. Rodriguez had spent the morning studying aerial photographs and monitoring enemy radio traffic, trying to identify the safest route through what had become a heavily fortified area. The bad news is they've got checkpoints on every major approach route, Rodriguez explained, pointing to marks on his map. The good news is they're spread thin, trying to cover so much ground. If we time this right, we can slip between their positions. Chen had been working on Maria's shoulder wound, cleaning it thoroughly and applying fresh antibiotics. The infection was still serious, but the fever had broken and she was thinking more clearly than she had in days. "How are you feeling, Sergeant Santos?" Chen asked as he secured the new bandage. "Better than yesterday. Not as good as I'd like," Maria replied honestly. "But I can make 8 kilometers if that's what it takes." Rodriguez nodded approvingly. "The extraction window opens at 1800 hours. We need to be in position at the landing zone 15 minutes early to secure the area and guide the helicopter in. That gives us about 4 hours to cover the distance." The route they had chosen avoided the main roads and trails, following instead a series of ridgelines that would provide good observation while keeping them away from likely patrol areas. It was longer than the direct approach, but potentially much safer. They left the cave in single file, with Chun again taking point and Rodriguez bringing up the rear. Maria was amazed at how much better she felt with proper medical treatment and the knowledge that she wasn't facing the journey alone. The two reconnaissance soldiers moved with practiced efficiency, constantly scanning for threats while maintaining a pace that pushed Maria to her limits without exceeding them. The first 2 hours passed without incident. They encountered no enemy patrols and made good time across the broken terrain. Maria began to allow herself to hope that the worst of their ordeal might be behind them. That optimism was shattered when Shin suddenly raised his fist, signaling a halt. Through hand signals, he indicated that he had spotted movement ahead. Rodriguez moved up to join him while Maria remained in position, watching their back trail for signs of pursuit. Through his binoculars, Rodriguez could see an enemy checkpoint that hadn't been there during their morning reconnaissance. A squad of soldiers had established a blocking position at exactly the point they needed to cross to reach the extraction zone. "Looks like they figured out our general destination," Rodriguez whispered to Chun. "We're going to have to find another way around." The detour would add at least an hour to their journey, time they couldn't afford to lose if they wanted to make the extraction window. But attempting to fight their way through a prepared position would be suicidal, especially with Maria's limited mobility. They backtracked half a kilometer and took a different route that led through a narrow valley system. The terrain was more difficult, but it would eventually bring them out near the extraction point from an unexpected direction. The sun was getting lower when they encountered their second major obstacle. A helicopter patrol was systematically searching the very valley they were traveling through, flying back and forth in an overlapping pattern that would eventually spot anyone trying to move through the area. Rodriguez made a quick decision. "We wait out. Better to be late than dead." They found cover among a cluster of large boulders and settled in to wait for the helicopter to finish its search pattern. Every minute that passed brought them closer to missing their extraction, but moving while the aircraft was overhead would guarantee discovery. Maria watched the enemy helicopter through gaps in the rocks, noting its flight pattern and timing. "Sergeant, if we time this right, we might be able to move during their turnaround cycles. They're taking about 3 minutes to search each section, then turning around for the next pass." Rodriguez studied the helicopter's movements carefully. "You're right. If we move fast and time it perfectly, we might be able to advance during their blind spots." They began a nerve-wracking game of cat and mouse with the circling aircraft. When a helicopter was at the far end of its pattern, they would sprint forward to the next piece of cover. When it approached their area, they would freeze and wait for it to pass. The technique worked, but it was exhausting and time-consuming. By the time the helicopter finally moved on to search another area, they were still 2 kilometers from the extraction point and had less than an hour before the pickup window opened. "We're going to have to push hard," Rodriguez told Maria. "Can you handle double time for the next hour?" Maria nodded, though privately she wondered if her body could take that kind of stress. The infection had weakened her considerably, and she was already operating on reserves that were nearly exhausted. They began moving at the fastest pace Maria could sustain, taking a more direct route despite the increased risk of detection. Chun ranged ahead, scouting for obstacles while Rodriguez stayed close to Maria, ready to provide assistance if she faltered. With 30 minutes remaining until extraction, they crested a ridge and could finally see their destination. The landing zone was a flat area of ground surrounded by low hills, exactly the kind of terrain a helicopter would need for a safe approach and departure. It was also obviously a trap. Enemy vehicles were positioned around the perimeter, and soldiers were clearly visible moving through positions that would give them overlapping fields of fire on the landing zone. The enemy had figured out their destination and were waiting for them. "Son of a bitch," Rodriguez muttered as he studied the scene through his binoculars. "They beat us to it." Chun crawled up beside them and surveyed the situation. "I count at least 20 hostiles, plus whatever's in those vehicles. No way the 3 of us can clear that area before the helicopter arrives." Maria stared at the trap below them, feeling her last hope slipping away. After everything they had been through, after coming so close to rescue, it was going to end with her dying in these mountains after all. "There has to be another landing zone," she said desperately. "Somewhere else the helicopter could pick us up." Rodriguez was already thinking the same thing. He pulled out his map and began studying alternative locations. "There's a clearing about 2 kilometers north of here. It's smaller, but a good pilot might be able to get in and out." "Can we reach it in time?" Maria asked. "If we move fast and don't run into any more surprises, maybe. But we'll have to call the helicopter and redirect them to the new location. That means breaking radio silence and probably alerting every enemy unit in the area to our position." Chun was monitoring enemy radio traffic. "They're talking about the helicopter on their frequencies. They know it's coming, and they know approximately when. They're planning to shoot it down if it shows up." Rodriguez considered their options carefully. All of them were bad, but some were slightly less suicidal than others. "We call in a course change and make a run for the alternate landing zone. It's the only chance we've got." He activated his radio and began transmitting on the emergency frequency. "Eagle Flight, this is Recon 6. Primary landing zone is compromised. Repeat, primary LZ is compromised. Redirect to alternate LZ north. Grid coordinates follow." The response was immediate and professional. "Recon 6, Eagle Flight copies course change to alternate LZ north. Inbound your location in 12 minutes. Advise ground conditions. Eagle Flight, expect enemy resistance. LZ is cold at this time, but that may change quickly. We will secure and mark the zone for your approach." The 3 soldiers began moving toward the alternate landing zone as fast as Maria's condition would allow. Behind them, they could hear increased radio chatter as enemy forces responded to the intercepted transmission. Vehicle engines started, and helicopters began converging on their area. The race was on. 12 minutes to cover 2 kilometers of difficult terrain, secure a landing zone, and extract before enemy forces could respond. Given Maria's weakened condition and the terrain they had to cross, it should have been impossible. But Rodriguez and Chun had not come this far to give up now. They half-carried Maria when necessary, choosing the most direct route regardless of cover or concealment. Speed was now more important than stealth. They reached the alternate landing zone with 3 minutes to spare. The area was smaller than the original extraction point, but it would accommodate a helicopter if the pilot was skilled and the approach was perfect. Chun began marking the landing zone with infrared strobes while Rodriguez established a defensive perimeter. Maria positioned herself where she could provide covering fire despite her limited mobility. The sound of rotor blades grew louder as the extraction helicopter approached from the south. At the same time, enemy vehicles were racing toward their position from multiple directions. It would be close. Eagle Flight, Recon 6. You have enemy vehicles converging on the LZ from multiple directions. Suggest fast approach and immediate departure. Copy that, Recon 6. Coming in hot and fast. Be ready to move. The helicopter appeared over the southern ridge, flying low and fast toward their position. It was a Black Hawk configured for special operations, with door gunners visible in the side windows. Enemy fire erupted from the tree line as the aircraft began its approach. Tracer rounds streaked across the landing zone, and the helicopter's door gunners returned fire with their mounted machine guns. Rodriguez grabbed Maria and began running toward the aircraft before it had even touched down. Chun provided covering fire, engaging enemy targets as they appeared at the edge of the clearing. The helicopter settled onto the ground with its engines still running at full power. The crew chief was waving frantically for them to board while the door gunners continued engaging enemy positions. Maria dove through the open door just as a burst of automatic weapons fire stitched across the ground where she had been standing. Rodriguez was right behind her, while Chun continued firing as he backed toward the aircraft. Go! 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 Rodriguez shouted to the pilot as Chun tumbled through the door. The helicopter lifted off immediately, banking sharply away from the landing zone as enemy fire intensified. Looking down through the open door, Maria could see enemy soldiers emerging from concealment all around the area they had just vacated. "Welcome aboard, Sergeant Santos," the crew chief said, helping Maria into a proper seat. "Let's get you home." As the Black Hawk flew toward friendly territory, Maria finally allowed herself to believe that she had survived her ordeal. The infection in her shoulder would require serious medical treatment, but she was alive and safe. More importantly, she was no longer alone. The two reconnaissance soldiers who had risked their lives to find her sat across from her in the helicopter, both grinning despite their exhaustion. "Thank you," Maria said, though the words seemed inadequate for what they had done. "That's what we do," Rodriguez replied simply. "No one gets left behind." As the helicopter carried them towards safety, Maria Santos closed her eyes and tried to process everything that had happened over the past 4 days. She had been wounded, alone, and surrounded by enemies who wanted her dead. But she had survived through a combination of training, determination, and the courage of soldiers who had come looking for her when everyone else had given up. The nightmare was finally over. But the memory of those dark days in enemy territory and the brotherhood that had saved her life would stay with her forever. The medical tent at Forward Operating Base Phoenix hummed with activity as doctors worked to treat Maria's infected shoulder wound. She had been unconscious for most of the helicopter flight back to friendly territory, her body finally allowing itself to shut down once the immediate danger had passed. "Sergeant Santos, can you hear me?" The voice belonged to Dr. Margaret Liu, the chief medical officer at the base. Maria opened her eyes to find herself lying on a clean white cot, surrounded by medical equipment and the familiar sounds of a military hospital. "Yes, ma'am," Maria replied, her voice hoarse from dehydration and fatigue. "How long have I been out?" "About 18 hours. We've been cleaning and treating your wound, plus dealing with the infection that had spread through your system. You're going to be fine, but it was close. Another day or two without proper treatment, and we might have been having a very different conversation." Maria tried to sit up, but Dr. Liu gently pushed her back down. "Not yet. Your body has been through severe trauma, and you need time to heal. The infection is responding to antibiotics, but you're still very weak." "Rodriguez and Chun, are they okay?" Maria asked, suddenly remembering the two soldiers who had risked their lives to rescue her. "They're fine. Both were treated for minor injuries and exhaustion, but they've already returned to duty. They've been checking on you regularly, though." I think they'll be relieved to know you're awake. Dr. Liu made notes on Maria's chart as she spoke. Can you tell me what happened out there? The debriefing team want to speak with you eventually, but for now, I just need to understand what your body went through. Maria recounted the basic details of her ordeal. The failed mission, the gunshot wound, the days of movement through enemy territory without adequate medical supplies. Dr. Liu listened carefully, occasionally asking questions about symptoms or treatments Maria had attempted in the field. You did an excellent job managing your wound under the circumstances, Dr. Liu finally said. Your field dressing probably saved your life by controlling the initial bleeding. And the fact that you recognized the signs of infection and started antibiotics when you did, that was crucial. A knock at the tent entrance interrupted their conversation. Major Harrison, the base intelligence officer, stood in the doorway with a folder under his arm. Dr. Liu, is Sergeant Santos able to answer a few questions? Dr. Liu checked Maria's vital signs one more time. 15 minutes, then she needs rest. And nothing too stressful. She's still recovering. Major Harrison pulled up a chair beside Maria's cot and opened his folder. Sergeant, I need to understand what happened during your mission. The intelligence we received suggested a simple weapons depot, but your radio reports indicated something much larger. Maria told him everything she remembered about the compound she had been sent to observe. The major took detailed notes, occasionally asking for clarification about specific buildings or activities she had witnessed. This matches what we've been able to piece together from other sources, Major Harrison said when she finished. The facility wasn't just a weapons depot, it was a major command and control center for enemy operations in this entire region. The intelligence failure that sent you in there unprepared is being investigated. What about the leak? Maria asked. Someone gave them my approximate location before I was even detected. Major Harrison's expression grew serious. We're looking into that as well. The enemy response was too coordinated and too immediate to be based on chance detection. Someone with access to operational planning may have compromised your mission. The implications of his words sank in slowly. Someone on their own side had betrayed her mission, leading directly to her being wounded and stranded in enemy territory. The thought was almost as disturbing as everything she had endured during her escape. I want you to know that your actions out there likely saved lives, Major Harrison continued. The intelligence you've gathered about the true nature of that facility has already been used to adjust our operational planning. Several missions have been modified based on what you observed. After the major left, Maria was visited by Rodriguez and Chun, who brought her personal items that have been recovered from her equipment. Seeing the two men again brought back vivid memories of their desperate journey to the extraction point. How are you feeling, Sergeant? Rodriguez asked, settling into the chair Major Harrison had vacated. Like I got run over by a truck, but alive, Maria replied. I still can't believe you guys found me out there. What made you decide to look in that particular area? Chun grinned. Actually, it was partly luck and partly good intel work. We had been monitoring enemy radio traffic and noticed they were concentrating search efforts in specific grid squares. We figured whatever they were looking for that hard had to be important. Plus, Rodriguez here has a thing about not leaving people behind, Chun added. When we heard about your situation, he volunteered for the mission immediately. Rodriguez looked slightly embarrassed. It's what anyone would have done. You don't abandon a fellow soldier, especially when they're wounded and alone. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Colonel Sandra Mitchell, the base commander. Both Rodriguez and Chun stood immediately, but the colonel waved them back to their seats. At ease, everyone. I want to personally thank all three of you for what happened out there. Sergeant Santos, your actions during the mission showed exceptional courage under extremely difficult circumstances. And Sergeant Rodriguez, Specialist Chun, your rescue operation was exemplary. She turned to address Maria directly. I've recommended you for the Purple Heart for wounds received in combat, and I'm also recommending you for the Bronze Star for your actions in enemy territory. The way you evaded capture for 4 days while wounded and then assisted in your own rescue, That's the kind of courage we expect from our soldiers. Maria felt overwhelmed by the recognition. Thank you, ma'am, but I was just trying to stay alive and complete my mission. Sometimes that's exactly what courage looks like, Colonel Mitchell replied. Now, Dr. Liu tells me you'll be returning to full duty within a few weeks. When you're ready, we'll have another assignment for you. If you're interested. After the colonel left, Maria lay back against her pillow and tried to process everything that had happened. For days ago, she had been convinced she would die alone in enemy territory. Now she was safe, recovering, and being recognized for action she had taken simply to survive. You know what the strangest part is? She said to Rodriguez and Chun, who were preparing to leave. What's that? Rodriguez asked. During those first 2 days alone, I kept thinking about how I had failed the mission. I was so focused on the intelligence I hadn't gathered, the objectives I hadn't completed. It never occurred to me that just surviving and getting back with what I did observe would be valuable. She nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes the mission isn't what you think it is when you start out. Sometimes the mission becomes getting yourself and your knowledge back to where it can do some good. Over the following days, as Maria's strength slowly returned, she found herself reflecting often on her experience. The physical healing was progressing well, but she knew the psychological impact would take longer to process. She had learned things about herself during those dark hours in enemy territory. She had discovered reserves of determination and courage she hadn't known existed. But she had also learned about the importance of the connections between soldiers, the unspoken promise that no one would be abandoned, no matter how desperate the situation. The two men who had risked their lives to find her had honored that promise. They had ventured into enemy territory to rescue someone they had never met, based solely on the knowledge that she was a fellow soldier in need of help. Dr. Liu released Maria from the medical tent after a week of treatment, though she would remain on light duty for several more weeks while her shoulder fully healed. The infection had been completely eliminated, and the wound was closing properly. As she walked across the base compound for the first time since her return, Maria noticed how different everything looked. The familiar sounds and sights of military life seemed almost surreal after the isolation and constant danger she had experienced in enemy territory. She stopped by the communications center to file her final mission report, documenting everything she could remember about the enemy facility and the circumstances of her capture and escape. The report would become part of the intelligence database, potentially helping future missions in the same area. That evening, Maria joined Rodriguez and Chun for dinner in the base mess hall. It felt strange to be eating hot food while sitting at proper table after days of surviving on field rations while hiding in caves and ruins. So what's next for you? Rodriguez asked as they finished their meal. Dr. Liu says another week of light duty, then back to full status. Colonel Mitchell mentioned another assignment when I'm ready. Maria paused, considering her words carefully. I think I'm ready to get back to work. This experience hasn't made me want to quit. If anything, it's reminded me why this job is important. Chen raised his coffee cup in a mock toast. To getting back to work and to not having to do it alone. To not leaving anyone behind, Rodriguez added. To finding your way home, Maria concluded, touching her cup to theirs. As they sat talking in the warm light of the mess hall, surrounded by the comfortable sounds of other soldiers sharing their own stories and experiences, Maria Santos reflected on how much had changed in just a few short days. She had gone into enemy territory as an individual soldier with a specific mission. She had returned as someone who truly understood the bonds that held military units together and the lengths to which soldiers would go to protect one another. The wound in her shoulder would heal completely within a few months, leaving only a small scar as a permanent reminder of her ordeal. But the lessons she had learned about courage, survival, and brotherhood would stay with her for the rest of her military career. Outside the mess hall, the sun was setting behind the mountains that separated the base from the enemy territory where her nightmare had begun. Those same mountains that had seemed so hostile and threatening now looked peaceful in the golden evening light. Maria knew she would return to dangerous missions in the future. The nature of her work guaranteed that she would face life-threatening situations again. But she also knew that she would never again face them completely alone. The radio that had seemed so silent during her darkest hours would always carry the voices of fellow soldiers who shared her commitment and her risks. And somewhere out there, other reconnaissance teams would be ready to venture into enemy territory if she ever needed them again. The knowledge that rescue would always be attempted, that no soldier would be written off or abandoned, had made all the difference during those desperate days of survival. It was a promise that went both ways. Just as others had risked their lives to save her, she would do the same for them when the time came. As Maria Santos walked back to her quarters that night, she carried with her not just the memory of survival against impossible odds, but the certainty that she was part of something larger than herself, something worth fighting for, worth risking everything to protect. The mission was complete. She had made it home, and she was ready for whatever came next.